Hi, this is DK Marley, the Hisfic Chickie. Thanks for joining the podcast today. So much has been going on at the new website, the Historical Fiction Company, and I'd like to thank everyone who has joined as a member or just browsed the aisles in our bookshop. I'm very happy to welcome to the show today historical fiction novelist Alfred Nicols, the author of Lost Love's Return. Alfred Nicols received undergraduate and law degrees from the University of Mississippi. Following military service, he had a career as a lawyer, a state trial judge, and a federal judge. He and his wife Mary live on a rural acreage in Mississippi. Lost Love's Return was written as an effort to leave his children and grandchildren, perhaps others, insight into issues in life and the value of family ties, even to imperfect people. Welcome to the show today, Alfred. To get started, we would love to know the answer to the very first question, which is, what literary pilgrimages have you gone on?
None.
All righty, well, that's okay. How about the next one? What's the best writing tip you can think of, something that has really helped you?
When you start sharing your work with friends and family for beta reads, pay no attention to critical comments until you basically hear the same thing several times. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, you will run around in circles and make little forward progress.
That's very good advice. Thank you for that. So what do you think are some of the common traps for aspiring writers? How about give us some advice for young writers starting out?
Trying to write from the omniscient point of view, thinking that's the easiest. It is the hardest, requiring more discipline and control than most beginners have. Write from the first-person point of view if the story will possibly lend itself to being written that way. This avoids distracting head-hopping, getting lured down meaningless rabbit trails, and gives an immediate personal and credible narrative voice, which is much harder to obtain in the omniscient.
Yes, that's some very good advice. Well, let me ask you this. If you could tell your younger writing self anything, what would it be?
First, spend at least a year studying and mastering the craft of creative writing. Identify the various principles and seek to master them. What is point of view? What are the advantages and disadvantages? What makes good or poor dialogue? Good or poor narrative? How do you balance the two? What about dialect? Do you need any? How much is too much? Do you care about it being marketable? How long can it be and still be marketable? Is there any market for what you're thinking about writing? What makes for good plot? Learn to use word search frequently to see if you're overusing certain pet words. There are many others.
That's some really good advice that I think all of us wish we had told our younger self, that we could go back. A lot of lessons to be learned on a writer's journey. Well, what other authors are you friends with, and how do you think they help you become a better writer?
Elizabeth Guider, Neil White, and Joyce Blaylock have given me pointers at times, but I have had very little opportunity to be in contact with them, and it's been a primary solitary process.
Yes, writing is oftentimes very solitary, isn't it? Well, can you give us a quick review of a favorite book by one of your author friends?
Neil White was once a very bright and ambitious young man who was off to a great start as a publisher. He got over his head in debt, which resulted in him being involved in some things that caused him to get sent to a federal prison in Louisiana, which was the home to the last leper colony in the country.
Oh, goodness.
He wrote a captivating memoir about his experience in prison with the lepers by the title of In the Sanctuary of Outcasts, published in 2010.
Wow, that's pretty amazing. I would love to look that up. I am definitely going to look that up. That seems quite interesting. Well, how did publishing your first book change your process of writing, or did it change it at all?
I'm now just publishing my first novel, and there's no way at this point I can discern this.
Okay, well, that's fine. Well, we'd love for you to come back and tell us what your experience has been when you start working on your next one. So what do you think was the best money you've ever spent as a writer?
Hiring a good publicist.
Oh, very good advice. Very good advice. So I love this next question. So what was an early experience where you learned that language had power?
The day I realized that the words yes sir, no ma'am, thank you, and please got me more cookies than the kids who had not mastered these words.
That's awesome. I love that. That is a perfect example of language having power. So, tell us about what you think is the best way to market your books. I know that this is your first one, but how do you feel like it's been the best way or is going to be the best way?
Relying on the advice of my publicist and working hard to give them what they need to promote me.
That's very good advice. And yes, I recommend that too. Hiring a publicist is always a great way to market your books. So tell us what kind of research you've done and how long do you usually spend researching before beginning a book?
The first step is probably to research what other books have been written in the genre to be sure that I'm not duplicating what someone else has done. Then I buy and read other similar books to get a feel for whether I can write something different and worthwhile. Then I buy books on the historical period and the historical aspects. Next, I take a shot at plotting a story I think I can write. After this research, the research is chapter by chapter. I see a scene I want to create, then I research the setting, street scenes, clothing, vehicles, used for transportation, travel time between points, everything I need that I need to know to feel myself in the scene I'm trying to create. For my novel, Lost Love's Return, I estimate I spent at least 4 hours of research for every hour I spent writing. Often I would spend 2 days researching the setting for a scene to get a feel that I was in that scene and then write the scene in 2 hours.
Very good. Thank you so much for sharing that. Well, this next question is, I like to throw in every once in a while, just as something different. So, do you view writing as a kind of spiritual practice?
Indeed, it has been described by some as an out-of-body experience. Somehow these fictional characters become living, breathing people like watching a movie.
Yes.
And you just write down what they do and say to each other in your mind, like you're snooping on the lives of real people. And then you look back later and you have no idea where all this came from. It is indeed the strangest spiritual and emotional experience imaginable.
Yes, most definitely. I have to agree with you 100% on that. There's times that you definitely don't know where these things come from. Well, let me ask you this next one. What do you think are the ethics of writing about historical figures?
I'm personally unaware of any accepted standard, but for me, it's fine to relate historical events the figures were involved in and repeat the quotes that were credibly attributed to them, to put them in personal and social settings where the author lets them talk and act in ways that the author nor anyone else living could know is absurd to me. No one knows what Anthony and Cleopatra said to each other the first time they had sex, nor if they said anything at all. And for an author to pretend to know is absurd.
Well, thank you for that visual. And that is very true. All right, I'm going to go on to the next question. What do you think is the most difficult part of your artistic process in writing?
By far, the discipline it takes to be successful. For over 50 years of my life, I created large landscape paintings. At least 60 can be seen on my website, WWW.southernlandscapepaintings.com, or by simply doing research for my name, which will usually bring you there. Facing a blank canvas with no idea what you could do with it and starting to create something from a blank canvas took commitment and a huge amount of discipline. When I decided to devote myself to writing, there was no difference in facing a blank canvas and a blank page. The naive think successful creative people are successful because they are uniquely creative and talented. Certainly, talent helps. But there are many other people who are equally creative and talented. And most of those who enjoy any significant success have the discipline and commitment it takes to fight those blank canvases or those blank pages until they do finally create something worthwhile.
That's very, very true. Thank you so much for sharing that. Well, now we're going to leave that open to you. This is your opportunity to tell us about your novels, and we would love to just leave the floor open for you.
We're approaching the centennial of World War I. A history major, I was familiar with this war, but had no idea the horror of it for those on the battlefield, the incredible tragedy and loss of life. I had read Steinbeck's East of Eden years before, always my favorite novel. Steinbeck shed light on so many of the biggest issues in life in this novel. Suddenly I decided what Steinbeck did in a big way with his 700-page epic, maybe I can do in a small way. But I was immediately confronted with two realities in today's literary world. Steinbeck, being a famous writer, had almost unlimited ink. My debut novel needed to be less than half the length of East of Eden. And secondly, I'm confronted with oft-repeated advice: if you want to write successful fiction, write to entertain, do not try to edify. Thus comes a decision. Do I want to write to be commercially successful, or do I want to try to hope to touch a few lives in a positive way? From my life experience as a lawyer and a judge, I was in a good position to do the latter, and I should try. If that's my mission, what edifying messages do I want to preach? The first became the tragedy of war, where men kill others essentially just like them because they've been told these others are the enemy, usually for political gain by people who are in no risk of death. Secondly, being involved with a charity that provides for abandoned children, I want to preach the value of family ties, even to imperfect people. Having these two early goals, I needed to create my initial characters. I chose to create Peter, the central character in the novel. He would be a uniquely honest, lovable young man from a strong, rigid, opinionated family background. He would be a disgrace to the family tradition, too tender-hearted to even kill a squirrel, a sissy in his grandfather's eyes, yet go on to kill numerous other humans. Why? How? Did those he killed deserve to die? He would bring out my theme of the absurdity and tragedy of war. The second theme I wanted to emphasize was the value of family ties, even to imperfect people. I wanted a character with no family ties. Thus, Elizabeth would be the daughter of a family prostitute with no family ties, abandoned to an orphanage at 4, knowing no father because her mother couldn't be sure who he was. Peter's narrow-minded, stern father and grandfather had caused Peter much emotional pain. Elizabeth would teach him the value of family ties, even to these imperfect people. At that point, I started looking for other issues in life I could embrace in the story, emphasizing the choices we make in life and their consequences. And I realized that to do so, I would need a multi-generational epic, but a very tight and concise one.
Thank you so much for sharing that, and very intriguing, and I'm sure our listeners are anxious to get their hands on this book and learn about all of this that you've shared with us. So can you share with us what is your favorite line or passage from your own book?
From my core motivation of leaving my grandchildren with insight into the big issues of life and the value of family ties, even to imperfect people, it would be this one. What about your Paul? Peter asked. Did you ever find out anything about him? She fell silent. Finally, she answered the question in a voice that let him know she was about to cry. I asked Beatrice Denny if she knew anything about my father, if she knew who he was. Ain't no way of knowing, little Lacey, she said. Your mama didn't know. Wasn't no way for her to know which man was your father. Elizabeth began to weep. Peter said nothing, continuing to stroke her as she cried. In time, she stopped and looked up at him, tears flowing down her face. Peter, my mother was a whore. Whoever my father was is unknown because he paid to be unknown. This was something she had never said before aloud to anyone else. She pushed her face tighter against his chest. There was neither sob nor sound, but tears continued to seep from her eyes. Suddenly, Peter could hear his grandfather's voice, words he had heard all of his life. We Montgomerys are hunters. We Montgomerys believe the Bible is the Word of God. We Montgomerys do our duty in time of war. These words had brought Peter heartache, pain, and resentment so many times in his life. They were now words he realized he had been so very blessed to hear. He hugged Elizabeth harder than ever. They lay down together on her couch in this embrace, her against him, his arm around her. In time, he stopped stroking her. All was quiet and still. Peter was not about to break the silence, for there was nothing he could think of to say.
Thank you so much for that. Now, from your favorite line or passage, can you tell us a little bit about what was your hardest scene to write?
The novel needed 3 sex scenes to drive the plot. The first sex scene was the hardest scene to write. I must have rewritten it a dozen times. Most people have a sexual component in their lives. I wanted to bring home to my granddaughter, perhaps others when old enough to confront this part of life, that cleavage is not necessary to have a body that is very sexually stimulating to most men. Breast augmentation is most unnecessary, sometimes painful and dangerous. And I wanted her to understand that first sex might not be pleasurable, may even painful, but with patience for most people it usually gets much better. And I wanted her to understand that the best sex will usually come in the company of love. For all my grandsons and my granddaughter, I wanted them to understand that men have various sexual performance phases. Young men usually on one end of the spectrum, old men on the opposite. And if they and their partners will deal with it with grace and patience, it is usually insignificant in the overall context of a relationship. To make these points, the sex scenes need to be reasonably graphic, but I wanted them to be no more so than necessary and as truthfully written as possible. It was a very hard balance to achieve.
Wow, that's amazing. I love the way you explained that and how the passion behind of the reasons why you were trying to get this right. I think that is incredible that you were doing this for your grandchildren and wanted to get it exactly right for them. So this last question, we're to the end of the interview, and I like this question because it oftentimes tells something about the author themselves. Can you tell us your favorite quote? Not necessarily from your book, but just your favorite quote, and how the quote tells us something about you.
From the poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. I got this from a teacher about 65 years ago, and I have always remembered it when I got tired and working long hours and wanted to quit. The heights of great men reached and kept were not attained by sudden flight, but they, while their companions slept, were toiling upward in the night.
Thank you for sharing that. And I'm going to end it on that because I think it's a beautiful quote to end the interview on. Thank you so much for being here today. And in addition to the HFC interview questions that we provided to Mr. Nichols, Alfred has sent us some insightful written answers that I'd love to share with the audience. One of the questions is, you've had successful careers in both law and art, so what inspired you to turn to writing? His answer is, I have written in some form for most of my life. In high school, I wrote a poem that won a national award and several other writing contests. As an undergraduate in college, I always excelled in the courses that required long narrative answers, courses in history and literature, for instance. In law school, I wrote for the Law Journal. As a lawyer, in every group I practiced with, I was usually the one called upon to write the briefs on the most important case in the office. As a judge, I wrote extensively, not just opinions, but creative things. For instance, I was asked by the State Bar to help write a jury orientation video, with me as the judge actor, which has been in use statewide for over 30 years. But I always wanted to write creative fiction. I have started more novels than I own pairs of footwear. My first one almost 60 years ago when I was in Korea on active duty with the Army. Something always intervened and I never finished one. I was a young lawyer trying to get established, working 70, 80 hours a week. I was a father with young children who had scout projects, sports events to attend. Then I started painting southern landscapes. It wasn't long before my paintings were selling, and I soon had more demand for my paintings than I could fill. Requests came for one-man shows needing 50 or more original paintings, 2 years or more of work with a full-time day job. Finally, about 6 years ago, a close friend who had pushed me for decades to write creative fiction got on a hard sell and wouldn't let up until I agreed to try. There was no turning back. He would push me for the next chapter to review and edit. I challenged myself to see that he got it. Once he had invested his time in the project, I felt some obligation to complete it. So the second question was, how has your own military experience helped with you writing those aspects of the book? Alfred's answer was, through an advanced ROTC program in college, I was commissioned an officer in the Army with a 2-year commitment to active duty military service. Part of the program was 6 weeks of training, basic training at Fort Benning in Georgia. With this training, I got to experience crawling beneath barbed wire under simulated live fire, the deafening sounds of artillery fire, being put in a chamber full of tear gas where I better have had my face mask, right? And whatever else the Army could come up with to acclimate the trainee to the battlefield environment. I got orders to Vietnam with my unit in the middle of the conflict in 1966, but was pulled from the unit at the last minute because of a serious kidney problem. Reassigned to Korea, my kidney was operated on, and I spent time in a Quonset hut military world, somewhat like the one my character Peter Montgomery was in. I am sure these experiences gave me perspective on the battlefield and military hospital aspects of the novel. The third question, you've said you've wrote this novel to pass down to your sons and grandchildren. Can you explain? With a long and blessed life in my law office, in the courtroom, in social settings, my family environments, I have experienced constant opportunity to observe humanity in all its dimensions. Love and hate, good and evil, faith and doubt, pain and pleasure, wealth and poverty, our potential for jealousy, selfishness, resentment, and oppression, as well as all our potential for selflessness, concern, support, and love. Approaching 80, I felt I had learned much about the choices we make in life and their consequences. Jesus taught us so well with his parables. Perhaps I could create a novel with a plot, characters, and scenes that I could pass on what I've learned onto my children and grandchildren, and maybe even to others, to read when they were old enough. Number 4, what were some of the biggest challenges you faced writing the book? Alfred's answer? There were essentially 4. The first was creating a plot, characters, and scenes to fulfill my purposes and then weave them together in a compelling read. It was also important for me to write the dialogue in a way that the characters came to alive on the page without at the same time making the reading hard. There was also writing the 3 sex scenes that were necessary to carry the plot in a way that was graphic enough to bring home the messages I wanted to convey about that part of life, but no more so than necessary. And finally, doing all the tedious, time-consuming historical and cultural research necessary to write a novel covering 2 cultures, 2 world wars, the Great Depression, and an almost 3-decade time span. And, of course, the discipline and stamina it takes to write a 90,000-word novel, and hopefully do it well. And last, the 5th question, what do you hope readers gain from Lost Love's Return? Alfred's answer? Every scene in the novel was created from the inside out, so to speak. I had some lessons about life I wanted to convey. How can I create a scene with characters, plot, and action to make that point? There are so many life lessons along the way, chapter by chapter, and I end the novel with a biggie. There is power in faith. Much of our achievement and happiness depends on faith. Faith in ourselves, faith in others, faith that somehow our nation can overcome its problems, faith that the world can overcome climate change, faith that we can avoid nuclear disaster, and perhaps faith that there is a deity who can save us from our greatest fear of all, our mortality. Once again, Alfred, we thank you so much for being on the show today. Thank you for your insightful answers, and we are all excited to get a copy of Lost Love's Return, which is available now at the Historical Fiction Bookshop and on Amazon. Thank you to all my listeners who are listening in to the Hisfic Chickie. Really appreciate your constant support, and see you next time on the show. This is D.K. Marley, the Hisfic Chickie.